Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive, really getting into the intellectual foundations of modern naval strategy.
Hmm.
Our source material is pretty foundational stuff. Alfred Thayer Mahan, and specifically his immediate sharp analysis of the 1898 Spanish-American War.
Yeah, drawn from his work, Lessons of the War with Spain.
Exactly.
And our mission today, it's not just looking back, right? It's using this conflict, which was, relatively short, but strategically, wow, really profound, using it as a kind of living laboratory.
A laboratory, I like that.
Yeah, to try and pull out these fundamental, these constant principles of warfare that Mahan identified. These are the principles he was absolutely convinced remained unimpaired from age to age. Didn't matter if you had steam engines or iron ships.
That distinction is so important, isn't it? He wasn't just writing a history book.
Yeah, not at all.
It feels more like he was sounding an alarm bell. He wrote this analysis, it seems, to really push for a popular understanding of military and naval matters.
Yes, absolutely. He argued that public indifference, just not caring during peacetime, leads directly to strategic ignorance.
And then what happens? Emergency hits.
And boom, you get that unreasoning and unreasonable panic he talks about. And that panic forces politicians, generals, everyone into making really bad decisions.
He really connected the dots there, didn't he? Between, domestic policy, public opinion, and actual failure on the battlefield or at sea.
He did. He stressed that without an educated public, one that supports consistent long-term naval development, well, a nation is pretty much doomed to scramble when war breaks out. It can't plan properly.
And he backs this up by citing Napoleon, right?
He does. Napoleon famously saying, study the campaigns of Hannibal, of Caesar, the greats. And Mahan used that to dismiss this idea, which was apparently quite popular among some writers back then, that the whole era of steam power and armored ships had somehow made all the lessons learned from sailing ships completely irrelevant.
Which is such a powerful point, even today. Technology changes the tools, absolutely. And the speed of war, sure.
Right.
But it doesn't fundamentally change those underlying strategic principles. Things like logistics, concentration of force, picking the right objective.
Exactly. Whether you're moving supplies by, rowing galley or sail or a modern diesel engine, you still have to manage your communications, keep morale up, and crucially, maintain superiority at the decisive point. That doesn't change.
So the goal here, for us, and for you listening, is to see where those timeless principles, concentration, clear objectives, offensive defense, where they were either perfectly proved right during the Spanish-American War.
Or perhaps more interestingly, where the U.S., even though it won the war, made some, let's say, unnecessary operational blunders precisely because they ignored those principles.
Okay, let's dive into the first section then, the new global map and strategic choices.
Right.
Let's start with just the sheer scale of what happened after the war. Mahan argues that this conflict, despite being pretty brief, had consequences much in excess, he says, of typical hostilities.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just a little colonial skirmish over Cuba. It fundamentally reshaped the global strategic landscape for the United States, like it or not.
It was a real geopolitical shockwave, wasn't it? It kind of catapulted the U.S. onto the world stage as a major naval power, maybe before it was fully ready.
Totally unprepared in some ways. Mahan pointed out that the war was a direct, immediate precursor to the Hague Peace Conference, which is interesting in itself. But maybe more importantly, the sudden, almost accidental presence of the U.S. military in the Philippines. That immediately created friction in Asia.
How so?
Well, it directly confronted Russia's ongoing expansion. Mahan called it their quiet, superficially peaceful progress in the region. Russia had been sort of systematically expanding its sphere of influence, across Manchuria towards China.
And suddenly there's the U.S. Navy right there in Manila Bay.
Exactly. A new, unexpected geopolitical obstacle right in its path.
And this intrusion, this sudden American presence in the Pacific, it caused a really rapid shift in how other countries saw the U.S., didn't it?
You can see it almost overnight. Mahan uses the example of Japan, which is perfect. He noted that just, 3 years before the war, Japan had actually warned the U.S. against annexing Hawaii. They were skeptical of American expansionism. But then, almost immediately after the Battle of Manila Bay and the U.S. taking the Philippines, suddenly leading Japanese statesmen were publicly welcoming the U.S. presence there.
Wow, that's a quick turnaround. Why the change of heart?
Well, they were smart strategic thinkers, right?
Hmm.
They saw the bigger picture. Japan recognized the growing tension over commerce, over political influence in China. Everyone wanted a peace,
A great game in Asia.
pretty much. And they saw the United States crucial, maybe even necessary counterbalance to the expansionist plans of Russia, but also other European powers like Germany and France.
So the Spanish-American War was basically America's unexpected entry ticket into the really high-stakes strategic game being played out in the Pacific.
That's a great way to put it. An
Yeah.
unexpected ticket, yeah.
Okay, let's bring it back to the Caribbean, to the war itself. The stated political reason for the war was freeing Cuba.
Right. The avowed purpose.
So, logically, Cuba should have been the primary military objective.
Seems obvious.
But Mahan, ever the critic of, let's say, less than perfect strategic planning, he actually argues against making Cuba the initial target.
Mm-hmm.
He thought Puerto Rico should have been hit first.
And this is where you really see Mahan's genius for strategic geography. He wasn't just looking at maps. He was seeing lines of communication, choke points, strategic advantage.
Why Puerto Rico?
He framed Puerto Rico not just as another island prize, but as the absolute strategic key to the Caribbean. He famously called it the Caribbean Malta.
The Caribbean Malta. Okay, explain that comparison. Malta in the Med.
Think about Malta's position. It sits right there in the middle of the Mediterranean, squarely between southern Europe and North Africa, controlling the sea lanes towards Egypt and the Suez Canal.
Right. Dominates the Central Med.
Exactly. So Mahan argues if the U.S. had seized Puerto Rico first, what would that do to Spain?
It would put U.S. forces where?
Right on the flank of Spain's main line of communication to Cuba. Spain would have been forced back onto this extremely long line of communication, stretching thousands of miles all the way from Spain itself.
Ah, I see. So any Spanish ships trying to get to Cuba, reinforcements, supplies.
Would have had to sail right past a major U.S. naval base in Puerto Rico. That sea lane becomes incredibly vulnerable.
So U.S. ships based in PR, even smaller ones like cruisers or torpedo boats, could constantly harass those Spanish convoys heading for Havana.
Precisely. Harass, delay, intercept, molest. Makes Spanish logistics an absolute nightmare. It's like trying to choke the enemy at the source, making it incredibly difficult for them to sustain the fight in Cuba, maybe even without needing a huge, decisive fleet battle right away.
It forces Spain onto the strategic defensive, geographically speaking.
Yeah.
Makes them burn resources just trying to get there.
Exactly. Fighting geography far from home. But, and this is crucial, Mahan includes a really important strategic caveat, a reality check.
Okay, what's the catch?
While Puerto Rico might have been the superior choice for constraining Spain, it was actually less vital for the U.S. immediate mission. Our lines of communication to Cuba didn't really depend on controlling Puerto Rico. They were much shorter, originating from Florida.
Ah, okay. So it helps us hurt them more than it directly helps us achieve our own objective.
Right, and maybe the most pragmatic factor, the real deal breaker at the time. Our naval forces, the U.S. Navy, was only nominally equal to Spain's total fleet at the start of the war. Maybe slightly superior on paper, but not overwhelmingly so.
So taking both Cuba and Puerto Rico at the same time
So taking both Cuba and Puerto Rico at the same time.
was, as Mahan put it, quite out of the question. You simply couldn't divide your forces like that, not when you didn't have clear superiority. The principle of concentration, concentrating your force, absolutely could not be violated.
Which brings us right to that core, non-negotiable principle Mahan hammered home again and again, the absolute primacy of the Navy.
It's the bedrock. Everything else rests on it. Mahan states this rule so clearly. Unless the U.S. fleet could gain and then permanently control the waters separating the Spanish islands, particularly Cuba, from U.S. territory,
Then any U.S. superiority in land forces, even if we had 1 million soldiers ready to go, was completely neutralized, just useless.
you simply cannot risk putting troops ashore on those islands before you are absolutely certain you control the sea lanes around them. Mahan called it clearly foolish.
Yeah, it's military malpractice, basically.
The lesson there seems to be that naval uncertainty completely paralyzes the army. You could have the best equipped land force sitting in Florida, but if the enemy's fleet still has operational freedom in the Caribbean,
Those troops are effectively hostages. They can't be reliably supplied, they can't be reinforced, and crucially, they can't be safely withdrawn if things go wrong. They are completely dependent on control of the sea.
it really speaks to the deterrent power of a fleet too, doesn't it? Even one that might not win a stand-up fight.
Absolutely. Mahan highlights that the moment the U.S. demonstrated it could deploy and sustain a major, powerful fleet in the Caribbean, Spain's fate in Cuba was pretty much sealed. regardless of how good their soldiers were on the island itself.
The battle for the islands was effectively decided on the water, long before the first U.S. soldier waded ashore near Santiago.
That's the essence of sea power, according to Mahan. Control the sea, control the outcome.
Okay, this issue of strategic certainty, or maybe the lack of it early on, leads us directly into the first major operational blunder Mahan identified in the U.S. war effort, and that's the failure of coast defense.
Yes. This is a big one for him. The U.S. government, right at the start, was facing this really difficult, almost contradictory set of objectives.
On the one hand, mount the offensive attack on Cuba.
But on the other hand, simultaneously protect its own really extensive and, at the time, quite inadequately defended coastline, from Maine down to Texas.
And this fear of attack along the coast, which Mahan kind of lamented, was largely driven by that public panic he warned about.
Right, the unreasoning panic. Newspapers screaming about Spanish cruisers bombarding Boston or New York.
That fear translated directly into a crippling tactical decision, didn't it? The division of the battle fleet.
It did. The entire U.S. Atlantic battle fleet, which, remember, was only just about equal to Spain's total armored force, was split into two. You had Admiral Sampson's main division down south, ready for Cuba.
And then way up north, nearly 1,000 miles away at Hampton Roads, Virginia, you had the so-called Flying Squadron under Commodore Schley, just sitting there, waiting
to intercept any Spanish raiders heading for the East Coast. Mahan flat out calls this division contrary to sound practice, a fundamental error.
Okay, but why was the split so bad? I mean, people on the coast, governors, mayors, they were demanding protection, weren't they? Politically, it seems almost unavoidable.
Politically, maybe unavoidable. Militarily, according to Mahan, disastrous. And his analysis here is so key to understanding, I think, even modern defense debates about infrastructure versus deployable forces.
How so?
He argues that coast defenses, fixed fortifications, purely defensive, and the Navy mobile, inherently offensive, are complementary. They work together.
But they are not interchangeable.
Absolutely not. You cannot substitute one for the other effectively. They have fundamentally different strengths and fundamental weaknesses.
Okay, let's dig into that complementarity.
Yeah.
Because it seems like the core of Mahan's argument for investing in things like forts and coastal batteries during peacetime.
Right. Think about fortifications. Because they're fixed, tied to the earth, they can bear essentially unlimited weight. You can mount the biggest guns imaginable, protect them with the thickest armor or deepest earthworks. They provide a massive permanent defensive strength.
They can counterbalance an enemy's naval superiority in sheer numbers, potentially. They hold the ground.
Exactly. Now, contrast that with the Navy. Its defining strength is mobility, right?
Yeah.
It's unfettered by geography. It can go anywhere there's enough water. But because a ship has to float, it has to move, its ability to carry weight, the big guns, the heavy armor is always going to be comparatively small compared to a fixed fort. There's a physical limit.
So when you try to make the ship do the job of the fort, like coastal defense,
Or vice versa, try to make the fort project power offensively, you end up creating what Mahan called a hybrid failure, something that does neither job well.
and his core complaint then, the big lesson we need to pull out here, is that deficient coast defense, not having enough good forts, reacts unfavorably upon the war fleet. It cripples the Navy.
It absolutely does. It forces the inherently offensive Navy, the fleet whose job is to go find and destroy the enemy, into a passive defensive role. It's like chaining your best offensive weapon to the shoreline.
So if the coast defenses had been sufficient, if they'd been properly funded and built during peacetime,
The entire U.S. battle fleet could have concentrated from day one, focused solely on the offensive mission against Cuba, finding Cervera's fleet, establishing the blockade, without looking over its shoulder constantly at the U.S. coastline.
that lack of coastal defense directly led to violating the principle of concentration.
Directly. And this confusion of purpose, using ships for jobs best done by forts, also highlighted another strategic failure Mahana really criticized: the continued reliance on the Monitor-type warship.
Ah, the monitors. Leftovers from the Civil War, right? Those low-slung ships with a big turret.
Exactly. He called the Monitor another one of those hybrids. It was designed primarily for coastal defense, fighting in relatively calm, shallow waters.
but its design had serious limitations for general naval service.
Big time. The very low freeboard meant they were terrible seaboats, couldn't handle rough weather well, they were generally slow, they often had shallow draft, limiting where they could go. Crucially, they lacked the mobility and the sustained seaworthiness you need from a true ocean-going warship.
So they couldn't really project power effectively far from shore.
Right, and at the same time, they couldn't carry the kind of super heavy armor or guns that a land fort could, so it tried to be both a mobile fort and a ship.
And ended up being, in Mahan's view, not great at either role for general service.
Pretty much. And he pointed out the ultimate problem with relying on monitors, or any ship really, for static coastal defense. They are always, as he put it, liable to be withdrawn by an emergency, real or fancied.
Because they can move, someone will inevitably want them moved somewhere else in a panic.
Exactly, and we saw this happen immediately in 1898. All the brand new monitors built for the Atlantic coast, they were immediately diverted south to Key West out of panic over Cervera. And 2 monitors even went all the way to Manila, stripping the Pacific coast of its already, frankly, pathetic defenses.
So the assets designated for static defense were pulled away the moment a mobile threat appeared somewhere else,
Yeah.
undermining the whole concept.
Precisely. It's the perfect illustration of that Napoleonic axiom Mahan loved to, quote, exclusiveness of purpose is the secret of great successes and of great operations.
Keep your eye on the ball. Focus.
Yes. Relying on ships for coastal defense violates that singular purpose. It shows a fundamental confusion of objective, and it leads inevitably to what Mahan termed eccentric action.
Okay, that's a key term we should probably define clearly for anyone listening. What did Mahan mean by eccentric action?
Eccentric action, in his terms, means moving away from the principal strategic objective or moving away from the main line of operations against the enemy's core strength.
So in this case, the principal objective was dealing with Spanish power in Cuba, right? Particularly Cervera's fleet once it appeared.
Exactly. That was the strategic center of gravity. So by splitting the U.S. fleet and leaving Chalet's flying squadrons sitting up at Hampton Roads
The U.S. was diverting a huge chunk of its offensive power.
to an eccentric defense, it was defending a secondary target, the U.S. coast, rather than concentrating all possible force against the primary strategic center, which was Havana, Cienfuegos, and ultimately Cervera's fleet.
So Mahan's argument is pretty stark. The division of the U.S. fleet wasn't really forced by anything the Spanish did initially. It was a self-inflicted wound, driven by that national sin of neglecting shore defenses during peacetime.
Yes. It directly compromised the concentration of force needed to achieve decisive offensive results quickly and efficiently.
And this error, this defensive posture, it actually has strategic consequences that the Spanish anticipated, didn't they?
They did. Mahan actually noted that a Spanish naval officer, someone who had been their naval attaché in Washington before the war.
So he knew the U.S. situation well.
Very well. This officer apparently predicted before the war even started that the American fleet would necessarily divide itself into 2 squadrons, partly because of the geography, but mostly because he expected the U.S. political system and public opinion would force it, leaving the Gulf Coast potentially exposed.
Yeah. So the Spanish were actually counting on the U.S. defensive mindset and political fragility to weaken our naval posture.
It seems so. They understood, perhaps better than some Americans did at the time, how domestic politics could undermine sound military strategy.
Okay, that leads us perfectly into the next section. The fleet in being and the blockade strategy.
Right. Cervera's squadron.
Once war began and Cervera's fleet sailed from Spain, this concept of the fleet in being suddenly dominated U.S. strategy, didn't it?
Absolutely. Admiral Cervera's force, just 4 modern armored cruisers and a couple of torpedo boat destroyers, was numerically inferior to the combined U.S. fleet, no question.
But it represented this incredibly powerful, menacing idea, the fleet in being.
Exactly. And a fleet in being, in Mahan's doctrine and naval theory generally, is a naval force, even a weaker one, whose mere existence and its potential to operate near the war zone acts as a perpetual menace.
It doesn't have to actually fight and win a major battle.
Not necessarily. It just has to exist, remain mobile, and crucially remain unaccounted for. Its potential threat forces the stronger enemy navy to dedicate immense resources, time, and attention just to finding it, watching it, and containing it.
So Cervera's small squadron, even though it was objectively weaker, had this massive psychological and practical effect on the U.S. war effort.
Staggering effect.
Yeah.
Mahan details it beautifully. First, just the threat posed by Cervera was used as the primary justification for that monumental effort to bring the battleship USS Oregon all the way from the Pacific coast.
That epic 14,000-mile dash around South America.
Right. An incredible feat of engineering and seamanship. But strategically, the Navy Department felt they needed the Oregon to join Sampson's fleet to achieve absolute certainty of naval superiority before engaging Cervera or forcing the blockade. The fleet in being demanded overwhelming concentration against it.
Okay, so it forced a major strategic move. What else?
Second, just the simple existence of Cervera's squadron, once it reached the Caribbean, justified the intense, sustained, nerve-wracking watchfulness required to finally track him down and bottle him up in Santiago Harbor. Think of the resources poured into that search.
Constant patrols, intelligence gathering.
Exactly. And third, and perhaps most revealing of Mahan's point about public panic, Cervera's fleet, somewhere out there, drove the American public and politicians absolutely wild with fear.
The coastal panic we talked about earlier.
Magnified tenfold. Mahan was utterly scathing about this. He called the popular outcry the demands to scatter the U.S. fleet to defend every single port city from Boston to Galveston, uninstructed and ignoble. Harsh words.
Because it flew in the face of sound strategy concentration.
Completely. And the political consequence of this panic was immediate and severe. Mahan points out that the actual sailing of General Shafter's entire Army expedition from Tampa, the key land assault force meant for Cuba, was halted, stopped dead in its tracks for several days.
Why?
Because of a single, completely unverified, vague rumor that one Spanish armored cruiser and maybe some torpedo boats had been sighted in the Nicolas Channel near Cuba.
Just a rumor, not even confirmed.
Not confirmed. Think about that. One potential phantom Spanish cruiser and the entire U.S. land invasion grinds to a halt. That right there is the material, practical power of a fleet in being. It can paralyze the enemy's operations without firing a shot.
It really demonstrates that paralysis inherent in the purely defensive posture, doesn't it? Because the U.S. was so fixated on defending everything along its coast.
The mere possibility of an attack, however remote, allowed the weaker enemy, Cervera, to effectively dictate the pace and the risk profile of the U.S. offensive campaign. He held the strategic initiative just by hiding.
So before Cervera was finally located and cornered in Santiago, what was the main U.S. naval strategy?
Blockade. The U.S. chose blockade as the one decisive measure, Mahan says, sure though slow.
Okay, why focus on blockade rather than trying to force an immediate decisive battle, maybe off Havana?
Well, forcing a battle is hard if the enemy doesn't want to fight, right? Cervera was trying to avoid the U.S. main fleet, so the blockade of Cuba served this dual interlocking purpose, and it really embodies Mahan's idea of scientific, almost clinical warfare.
What were the two purposes?
First, militarily, the blockade was intended to slowly but surely exhaust the Spanish army already in Cuba. That army produced very little of its own food, almost no ammunition, and was heavily reliant on constant resupply from Spain.
Cut off the supplies, and the army withers on the vine.
Exactly. Starve it out, logistically. Second, and just as important strategically, the blockade was designed to put pressure on Madrid. The hope was that the deteriorating situation in Cuba would force the Spanish Navy, either Cervera's squadron or perhaps even the main reserve fleet still back in Spain, to eventually come out and try to break the blockade.
To relieve the island.
Yes, and that would bring them within striking distance of the concentrated U.S. fleet, allowing for the decisive battle the U.S. wanted, but on U.S. terms, close to U.S. bases.
It sounds a lot like economic warfare, using hunger and logistical pressure as the primary weapon.
It absolutely is. And Mahan was a strong advocate for this. He actually views the stoppage of enemy commerce blockade, seizing merchant ships, as the most scientific warfare because the least sanguinary.
It's bloody, you mean?
Exactly. His argument was that it drains men of their dollars instead of their blood. It attacks the enemy's economic capacity to wage war, which can be just as decisive as winning a battle, but potentially with much less loss of life on both sides.
That's counterintuitive to some modern ideas about targeting only military assets.
It is, but Mahan was quite firm. He argued that if nations agreed to eliminate attacks on commerce entirely, wars would likely become more bloody, not less.
Why?
Because the enemy would retain their financial power through trade for much longer. The war would drag on, and the final decision would have to rest entirely on major, costly fleet battles or land campaigns, inevitably increasing the sacrifice of soldiers' and sailors' lives. So for Mahan, commerce warfare, while perhaps unpopular or seemingly harsh, was actually the more efficient and ultimately less lethal application of sea power.
Interesting perspective. Okay, so the U.S. sets up the blockade. Then Mahan walks us through that incredibly tense period, those frantic 10 days in mid-May.
May 12th to May 21st, yeah, nail-biting time for the Navy Department.
After Cervera was finally sighted near Martinique in the Lesser Antilles, then reported off Curaçao near Venezuela, before he eventually slipped, undetected initially, into Santiago Harbor on the southern coast of Cuba. This was a real cat-and-mouse game.
A high-stakes one. The absolute primary strategic goal for the U.S. Navy at that moment was find Cervera, fix his location, and corner him. Everything else was secondary.
And Admiral Sampson, commanding the main U.S. fleet, initially made a move eastward, didn't he, towards San Juan, Puerto Rico?
He did. Based on what seemed like a very plausible calculation at the time, the thinking was that Cervera, needing coal and a secure base after crossing the Atlantic, would likely head for San Juan, the Caribbean, Malta, remember, to establish his base of operations before moving on Cuba.
Made sense on paper.
Logically, yes. But Mahan, analyzing it afterward, found Sampson's eastward move unfortunate, a strategic misstep.
Why? Even though the logic seemed sound.
Because it was that eccentric action problem again. It moved the main concentrated body of the U.S. fleet away from the true strategic center of the conflict.
Which was where?
The critical line between Havana, the capital and main Spanish court on the north coast, and Cienfuegos, the other major port on the south coast with access to the interior. That Havana Cienfuegos axis was the key to controlling Cuba.
So by sailing east to San Juan.
Sampson effectively uncovered both Havana and Cienfuegos, as Mahan put it. He left the two most important potential destinations for Cervera temporarily open.
What could have happened?
If Cervera had been a bit more efficient, maybe faster, or just luckier, he could potentially have slipped into either Havana or Cienfuegos, while Sampson was way over near Puerto Rico.
And that would have been a disaster for the U.S.
A massive headache, at the very least. Imagine Cervera's fleet operating out of Havana Harbor, right on Florida's doorstep, or Cienfuegos, threatening U.S. operations on the south coast. It could have prolonged the war for months, made the blockade incredibly difficult. Mahan insisted the U.S. fleet needed to stay concentrated between Havana and Cienfuegos, effectively controlling the interior lines of communication, allowing it to react quickly to threats at any of the key Cuban ports.
But luckily for the U.S., Cervera went into Santiago instead.
Luckily, yes. Santiago was a much less strategically valuable port for him, harder to supply, and easier for the U.S. to blockade tightly once he was found there.
And the moment Cervera was definitively located inside Santiago Harbor, the entire strategic objective of the U.S. Navy immediately snapped into sharp focus, didn't it?
Absolutely. Everything clarified instantly.
Yeah.
The focus shifted entirely away from just blockading Cuba generally to the singular overriding goal, destroy Cervera's fleet.
That became more important than even capturing territory.
Absolutely. The destruction of that squadron was seen as the key to ending the war quickly. Mahan quotes one of the American admirals off Santiago, might have been Sampson himself, saying quite bluntly before the final battle, "The destruction of this squadron will end the war."
And it did, basically, once Cervera's ships were sunk trying to escape Santiago.
The war was effectively over. Spain lost its naval capacity in the theater, lost the ability to support Cuba, and the political will back home collapsed very quickly.
And the Army's role in attacking Santiago from the land side, that was just a means to achieve the naval objective.
Precisely. The Army assault, the famous charge up San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill, was necessary primarily to put pressure on the Spanish defenses of Santiago Harbor from the landward side. The goal was to make the harbor untenable for Cervera's ships, forcing them out into the guns of the waiting U.S. fleet.
Why the rush? Why not just maintain the blockade indefinitely?
Two reasons, mainly. First, maintaining a close blockade was exhausting for the U.S. ships and crews. Constant vigilance, risk of torpedo attack, strain on machinery. Second, and critically, the impending hurricane season.
Weather.
Yes. The U.S. Navy could not risk having its main battle fleet caught on blockade duty off Cuba's south coast by a major hurricane, which typically arrives in late summer or early fall. That could have been catastrophic. So they needed to force the naval issue, force Cervera out before the dangerous weather arrived. The Army's land attack was the catalyst to make that happen quickly.
Okay, let's talk about the ships themselves.
Yeah.
Section 4. Doctrine, design, and future naval needs.
Right. The lessons learned, or that should have been learned, from the war regarding the actual hardware.
The success at Santiago, but also all the difficulties leading up to it. The split fleet, the Oregon's dash, the reliance on blockade, offered Mahan some really powerful lessons, not just on strategy, but on naval design. Specifically, he waded into that perennial debate. Numbers versus size. Lots of smaller ships or fewer bigger ones.
Yeah, this is a debate that never really goes away, does it? Mahan noted this ever-importunate demand, as he called it, for increase in dimensions in the single ship, building bigger and bigger battleships.
A tendency the U.S. had inherited from its early history, right? The success of those heavy frigates like the U.S. Constitution.
Exactly. Build fewer but individually more powerful ships. Mahan fundamentally argued against taking that too far, against making individual ships too big if it came at the expense of the total number of ships in the fleet.
Because his focus, as always, was on the ultimate goal. The maximum offensive power and strategic flexibility of the fleet as a whole, not just the power of a single super battleship.
Precisely. And why did the experience at Santiago, in his view, prove the crucial need for numbers?
Let me think. Was it about redundancy?
Exactly. Redundancy and operational availability. Think about the day of the actual Battle of Santiago Bay, when Cervera made his desperate run out of the harbor.
Okay.
On that very morning, the U.S. battleship Massachusetts was actually absent from the blockade line. She was over at Guantanamo Bay, coaling, taking on fuel.
Right. A necessary logistical task.
Absolutely necessary. And at the same moment, Admiral Sampson's flagship, the armored cruiser New York, was also temporarily away from the line. He had gone east to confer with General Shafter.
So 2 major U.S. ships were off station when the battle started.
Yes. But because the U.S. squadron had sufficient numbers, they still had several other battleships and cruisers on the line. The proportionate loss of fighting strength from those 2 temporary absences wasn't crippling. The remaining ships were numerous enough to maintain the blockade effectively and then successfully engage and destroy Cervera's escaping squadron.
Ah, I see. But if the U.S. had had, say, only 4 or 5 much larger super battleships instead of the mix they had?
Then the temporary loss of just 1 or 2 of those giants for routine coaling or minor repairs or any other reason would have severely compromised the concentration of force needed. It would have opened a dangerous gap in the blockade or significantly weakened their battle line at the crucial moment. Numbers provide resilience.
So if a country has a limited budget, a limited amount of aggregate tonnage it can afford to build, Mahan was firmly in the camp of building more numerous, perhaps slightly smaller or medium-sized ships, rather than putting all the eggs in a few giant baskets.
For strategic flexibility, absolutely. He used a very practical example from the war itself. After the victory at Santiago, the U.S. decided it needed to send a squadron under Commodore Watson potentially towards Spain itself, or at least to the Philippines.
Right, to threaten the Spanish homeland or secure the Pacific Games.
And they were able to detach 2 battleships to form the core of Watson's squadron. Mahan points out, if the total U.S. battleship tonnage had been divided among only 5 super battleships instead of the 7 or so slightly smaller ones they actually had,
then detaching 2 of those 5 would have been impossible.
it would have completely dismantled the necessary fleet concentration needed elsewhere, like guarding the Atlantic coast or maintaining presence in the Caribbean. You lose the strategic flexibility to project power across newly acquired, very distant interests, like the Philippines. Numbers give you options.
Did Mahan propose an actual optimal size range for battleships based on these lessons and America's new global role?
He did, for the conditions of the time. He suggested an optimal range for future U.S. battleships should probably be somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 tons displacement.
And what technical characteristics did he stress most for those ships? Speed, guns, armor.
He stressed that speed, while important, was actually distinctly secondary to 2 other factors: offensive power, good guns and protection, and most importantly for the United States' new strategic situation, coal endurance. Range.
Why was speed secondary? That seems counterintuitive too.
Because, as he pointed out, the effective speed of an entire fleet is always limited by the speed of its slowest ship.
Ah, the convoy principle. You can only go as fast as the slowest member.
Exactly. So increasing the size and cost of battleship just to get a marginally higher individual top speed is largely wasted money if it means you can build fewer ships overall, or if those fast ships have to constantly slow down for their slower companions in the fleet, or if it compromises their fighting power or their ability to stay at sea.
And that endurance requirement, the range, that was directly tied to America's new Pacific reality, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The calculations changed overnight after Manila Bay. Mahan specified that future U.S. battleships had to be able to sustain a steaming radius of at least 3,500 nautical miles.
Why that specific number?
That's roughly the distance from Honolulu, Hawaii, the key mid-Pacific base, to Guam, which the U.S. acquired from Spain. Plus, you always need a margin of safety on top of that.
Wow. So the strategic consequences of the war immediately dictated the technical design requirements for the next generation of the U.S. fleet. It wasn't just about the Atlantic anymore.
Not at all. Mahan instantly recognized that the U.S. could no longer design its main fleet solely for operations across the Atlantic or in the Caribbean. The Pacific was now a primary theater, demanding ships with much longer legs.
He then pivoted in his analysis to attacking two major strategic fallacies that were apparently quite prevalent in public and political thinking at the time. The first one was this idea of a navy for defense only.
Oh, he hated that phrase. He argued against it vigorously, almost angrily. This popular notion, still heard sometimes today, that the U.S. only needs a navy for defense only.
Why did he see that as so dangerous?
He defined any military reliance purely on defensive warfare as inevitably leading to, quote, military ruin and therefore national disaster. His logic is brutal, but quite compelling.
What's the core argument?
The party that takes the offensive, the one striking the blow, has basically one thing to worry about: achieving their objective. They can concentrate their efforts. The defender, however,
The one waiting to be hit.
has, as Mahan colorfully put it, a dozen things to worry about, for he cannot know upon which interest the coming blow may fall. The defender is forced to try and protect everything, everywhere, all the time.
Which means scattering your strength, reacting rather than acting.
Precisely. You lose the initiative completely. Mahan insists that true, effective defense is actually found in the power to injure the enemy's interests, wherever they may be, even far from your own shores.
An offensive defense.
Yes, the best defense is a good offense, essentially. He used the example of potentially needing to exclude foreign control from the Isthmus of Panama, of vital U.S. interest, but geographically external to the continental U.S.
How would a defense-only navy handle that?
It couldn't, effectively. Mahan argues that a purely defensive navy has very little deterrent value because a potential enemy need fear no harm to their own interests if they decide to strike at one of your distant interests, like Panama or your commerce overseas. If you cannot strike back at them, you cannot reliably deter them from striking you first.
Makes sense. Okay, what was the second fallacy he tackled?
The fallacy of instant obsolescence. This hyperbole we still hear constantly today, that a new weapon system, a new ship, is somehow obsolete before she can even be launched.
Yeah, the pace of technological change makes things outdated quickly.
Mahan acknowledged the rapid changes happening in naval tech back then. He specifically mentioned the radical and confusing shifts in battleship design, moving away from the Civil War era turret ships back towards favoring the traditional broadside battery as the primary armament. He thought that was the right move, by the way. But he completely refuted the hyperbole that a ship becomes instantly useless the moment something newer comes along. His point was simple. A ship is not truly useless until it is physically worn out or hopelessly outclassed in every respect.
It still has value, even if it's not the absolute latest and greatest.
Absolutely. It remains a strategic asset. It's still an object of consideration, something both friendly and enemy planners have to account for throughout its gradual decline in relative capability. It still has mass, it still carries guns, it still occupies space on the board.
It might not be a frontline battleship anymore, but maybe it can still perform useful roles, like escort duty or coastal patrol, or just tying up an enemy cruiser that has to watch it.
Exactly. It retains strategic utility. The real problem, Mahan concluded, wasn't usually the pace of technological obsolescence itself. The real bottleneck was having enough trained personnel, skilled officers and sailors, to man both the first-line cutting-edge ships and all the older but still useful reserve vessels.
The manpower issue.
Yes. If a nation has the political will and the financial resources, an aging ship doesn't just disappear. It simply drops down into the reserve fleet, or becomes a training ship, freeing up the most experienced crews for the newest frontline combatants. Obsolescence only becomes a terminal problem if you can't afford to replace the ship eventually, or, more critically, if you don't have enough trained people to operate all the ships you possess, new and old.
That really brings us full circle, doesn't it? Back to his fundamental philosophy that naval strength isn't just about winning battles in wartime.
Not at all. It's about providing a powerful, organized, and visible force during peacetime, one that can support, as he put it, a nation's lofty political conceptions of right and of honor. The fleet is the tangible instrument of rational national policy, both in peace and war.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up. We're heading into the outro. So, what does all this mean for us today? If we distill Mahan's sharp analysis of that relatively small war over a century ago, what are the key takeaways? The lessons seem pretty constant, don't they?
Incredibly constant.
First, it seems, Domestic indifference and lack of public understanding really do create strategic panic and can lead directly to operational failure. You can't separate the home front from the battlefront.
Absolutely. That link is critical.
Second, operational freedom for your offensive forces, particularly the Navy, depends directly and heavily on sufficient domestic preparedness. Specifically, you must fund things like coast defense adequately in peacetime if you want to free your main battle fleet to actually go on the offensive and concentrate its power where it matters most.
Couldn't agree more. The two are completely linked. You neglect the base, you hamstring the fleet.
And third, while the psychological power of a fleet in being is undeniable, it can really mess with your enemy's head and plans. The ultimate strategic imperative, if you want to win decisively, is always to focus on the destruction of the enemy's main naval power through concentration and offensive action. Don't get paralyzed by the potential threat. Eliminate the source of the threat.
Well said. And we absolutely have to remember Mahan's deeper political objective in all of this. For him, the ultimate purpose of having this powerful, organized military force wasn't actually to wage war more effectively.
As to prevent it.
Exactly. It was to prevent war in the first place through effective deterrence. And his key insight was that a navy designed purely for defense only simply cannot provide that credible deterrent. It doesn't pose a sufficient threat to a potential aggressor's own interests.
So the U.S. needed then, and arguably still needs today, a naval force capable of supporting its political will globally, protecting its interests wherever they might be, and, as Mahan put it concerning new territories like the Philippines, ensuring to new subjects and partners peace and industry, order and stability.
Yes. Sea power as the enabler of peace and prosperity, ideally.
He even immediately saw the direct commercial consequences of naval victory, didn't he? Mahan pointed out that destroying Spain's naval power in 1898 didn't just lead to them losing Cuba and the Philippines.
No, the impact was much broader. It led directly, he argued, to the loss of their protected colonial markets and ultimately contributed to the death of Spain's merchant marine because they simply lacked the naval power needed to protect their own commercial shipping on the high seas anymore.
Naval control equals commercial control, or at least enables it.
That's a core tenet of Mahan's thinking. And that commercial consequence, that link between sea power and economic survival, it provides a really fascinating final thought for you, the listener, to consider today.
Okay, let's hear it.
Mahan identified the critical vulnerability of global commerce as residing in physical ships moving goods across the water. Control the sea lanes, choke the ships, you cripple the economy. That was the logic.
Right.
But today, the global commercial network, the world economy, relies on so much more than just surface vessels, doesn't it? It relies on this incredibly complex, interconnected, largely invisible global communication infrastructure.
You mean things like undersea data cables?
Sure.
Satellites for GPS and communication? Digital command systems coordinating global logistics in real time?
Exactly, all of that. So here's the question. If a future conflict, maybe between major powers, decided to adopt Mahan's least sanguinary approach, avoiding bloody battles, and focus purely on crippling those global communication routes instead of sinking battleships, how quickly could that strategy, paralyzing the digital and logistical backbone of the global economy, force compliance? And what modern, perhaps completely unexpected vulnerabilities might a 21st century Mahan identify within that digital infrastructure? Vulnerabilities that, if exploited, could force that compliance just as effectively as a naval blockade did in 1898.
That is definitely food for thought. It's like the principles are the same. Find the critical vulnerability, apply concentrated pressure, but the targets have shifted dramatically.
Precisely. Mahan's core lessons, written over a century ago about wooden ships evolving into steel ones, they're arguably still the essential starting point for trying to answer that very modern question. Because the fundamental principles of strategy concentration, objective selection, understanding lines of communication, offense versus defense, they remain constant, even if the technology has shifted from armored cruisers to fiber optic cables.
They are constant.
They are timeless.
And on that thought-provoking note, we conclude this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us.